Hello, friends. Welcome to Storycraft. On this channel, you will enjoy world top stories. Let's view the video. The Forest That Eats People. Anyone who enters never comes back, except for one survivor. The Vanishing Trail. Mysterious disappearances. Spark fear in the nearby town. A quiet town on the edge of fear. The small town of Ravenswood sat on the cusp of the Black Hollow forest, its weathered homes clustered along cobblestone streets. Nestled in a valley surrounded by thick woods, Ravenswood had always been a place of mystery. On the surface, it was quaint. Farmers, families, and old-timers gathered around the tavern telling stories about the old days. But beneath the surface, a deep unease had settled over the town for as long as anyone could remember. Every so often, someone would disappear, vanish without a trace, leaving behind nothing but speculation and fear. But this time, it was different. This time, the disappearance wasn't just another town legend. This time it was Daniel Carter, a local hiker, and his absence sent shockwaves through the community. Daniel was a familiar face in Ravenswood, a young man with an insatiable curiosity for the wilds of Black Hollow. He was the kind of person who always had a story to tell, someone whose laughter could light up the room. He'd been hiking the forest for years, never once coming close to the dreaded rumors of the forest's sinister reputation. His love for adventure and his ability to navigate the dense woods made him a legend among the local hikers. But on the morning he was supposed to return from his latest trek, no one saw him. The hours passed, then days, and by the third day, a palpable sense of dread had taken hold of Ravenswood. The first search party. By the time the townsfolk gathered at the edge of Black Hollow to search for Daniel, the atmosphere was tense. Sheriff Tom Reynolds, a no-nonsense man in his late 40s, had seen his fair share of strange occurrences. But something about this disappearance felt different. This wasn't just a lost hiker. This wasn't just another case of someone getting lost in the woods. Sheriff Reynolds stood at the head of the search party, which consisted of Daniel's close friends and a handful of volunteers from town. They stood at the trail's edge, gazing into the dark green depths of the forest. The trees were dense, their thick canopies blotting out the sunlight, casting the forest floor in shadows. It was a place that seemed to breathe with an eerie life of its own. "All right," Sheriff Reynolds said, his voice low and steady. "We're going in pairs. Keep your radios on and don't go off the trail. We're here to bring him back, not get lost ourselves." As the group began to disperse, the murmurs of doubt and fear began to rise. They knew the stories, they knew the rumors. The town had whispered about the forest for generations, and every new disappearance seemed to add fuel to the fire. But there had never been proof. There had never been a reason to believe that the forest itself was the cause of these disappearances. That was until now. The trail that vanished. The deeper the search party ventured into the forest, the more unsettling things became. The trail, once clearly visible and well marked, seemed to vanish as they moved forward. Trees grew closer together, their trunks gnarled and twisted. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the air felt heavy, thick with a sense of impending doom. At first they found nothing but silence. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive quiet that hung over the group. But then, as the trail grew fainter, something caught their attention. Daniel's backpack, half buried in a pile of fallen leaves, Jesus, one of the volunteers muttered, kneeling down beside the pack. Sheriff Reynolds stepped forward, his hand resting on his holster. The bag was still warm. It hadn't been abandoned long. But there was something wrong. It was too clean. No signs of a struggle, no broken branches, nothing that indicated a rush. It was as if Daniel had simply set his bag down and walked away. The group exchanged uneasy looks, but they pressed on, hoping to find more clues. The deepening mystery. Hours passed, and the forest seemed to grow more unfamiliar with each step. The trail, if it could still be called a trail, twisted in odd directions, leading them deeper into the heart of Black Hollow. Some of the searchers began to show signs of fear, their eyes darting around, their steps quickening. The forest was closing in on them, and something in the air had shifted. "I swear I saw something," one of the younger men, Peter, said. His voice trembled. "It was behind those trees, watching us." Sheriff Reynolds paused and scanned the darkened woods. There was nothing, but Peter's unease was infectious. The whispers of the past, tales of the forest's malevolent spirit, seemed to creep back into their minds. "Keep it together," Sheriff Reynolds commanded, his voice firm, but not without concern. "We're not stopping until we find him." The further they went, the more unnatural the forest seemed. The trees now looked as though they were deliberately bending away from the path. The leaves rustled, though there was no wind. The deeper, the group ventured, the colder it became, and the more it felt as if the forest itself was pushing them out. And then they found it. The clearing of bones. They came upon a small clearing, a hollow in the forest that felt untouched by time. At its center stood a weathered stone altar, surrounded by an array of human bones. Some of them were old, yellowed with age, others still fresh and cracked, as though they had been placed there recently. The sight made everyone stop in their tracks, their hearts racing. One of the men, Tim, stumbled back, his face pale. What the hell is this?" he gasped. Sheriff Reynolds knelt by the bones, inspecting them closely. He recognized a small silver pendant on the ground nearby. It was Daniel's. A chill ran down his spine. This was no ordinary disappearance. "Someone's been here," Reynolds muttered, his voice low. "But who or what did this?" Before anyone could respond, a low, guttural growl echoed from the trees, sending a wave of panic through the group. The chase. In an instant, the clearing became chaos. The growl turned into a shriek, piercing and inhuman. Sheriff Reynolds grabbed the pendant from the ground and shouted for the group to run. But the forest had other plans. One by one, the search party was picked off. Screams rang out through the trees, but when Reynolds turned, there was nothing. No sign of the men who had been with him just moments before. The forest was alive and it was hunting them. Reynolds didn't stop running. He couldn't. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to get out, to escape the grasp of the forest's dark hold. His legs burned as he pushed through the undergrowth, but the sounds of pursuit grew louder. It felt like hours before he broke through the trees and stumbled back to the outskirts of Ravenswood. When he collapsed on the town's edge, out of breath and covered in dirt, there was only silence behind him. The survivors' return. Sheriff Reynolds was the only one to make it out of Black Hollow that day. His face was drawn, his eyes haunted by the things he'd seen. He never spoke of what had happened to the others. He couldn't. But the people of Ravenswood knew. They knew what the forest had done. And they knew that once again, Black Hollow had claimed more souls. The return of silence. The days following Sheriff Reynolds' harrowing escape were filled with fear and confusion. Ravenswood had always been a quiet, peaceful place, but now there was a sense of dread that hung thick in the air. The people no longer spoke openly about the forest. The once innocent hikes, the casual trips into Black Hollow, had come to a grinding halt. The forest was no longer a place of adventure, but a dark, insidious entity that no one dared to approach. Yet, even as the town attempted to return to some semblance of normalcy, the memories of that night lingered. No one spoke much about it, but the fear was palpable in every corner of Ravenswood. There were rumors, whispered late at night in the tavern, about strange sightings at the edge of the woods, figures moving between the trees, shadows where there should have been none. And then there were the whispers, faint and distant, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. Those who had been closest to the search party were the most affected. The survivors couldn't sleep. They would awake in the dead of night, drenched in sweat, their hearts racing, convinced that something was watching them from the darkness. Sheriff Reynolds, though he had physically returned, had not been the same. His eyes were hollow, his hands trembling. He hadn't spoken to anyone about what he had seen, but there was a tension in his posture, an unease that never left him. A meeting in the tavern. One evening, nearly a week after the search, a few of the surviving townsfolk met at the local tavern, a dimly lit building that had served as the heart of the community for generations. They sat in a quiet corner, their faces drawn and pale, nursing mugs of ale. The conversations had turned from idle gossip to something darker, as if the weight of what had happened in Black Hollow had finally started to take its toll. "What happened out there?" Peter asked, his voice shaky. He had been one of the first to report the strange sightings, the things he had thought he saw while on the trail. "I keep hearing things, whispers, voices that don't make sense. It's like the trees are talking to me." Tim, who had been with Peter on the search, shivered at the mention of whispers. He had heard them too. At first, he thought it was the wind, but as they ventured deeper into the woods, the voices became clearer, almost as though they were coming from inside his own mind. "I heard them too, Peter," Tim said quietly. "At first, I thought it was the others, but then—" He trailed off, unsure how to continue. Reynolds, who had been sitting in the corner, watching the conversation unfold, finally spoke. "It wasn't the wind," he said, his voice low and rough. "It was something else, something that doesn't belong in this world. I heard them too, and I saw them." The room fell silent. The few patrons still milling about froze, their gazes flicking nervously toward the sheriff, but Reynolds seemed to be talking more to himself than to anyone else. His mind was clearly elsewhere, replaying the horrors he had witnessed deep in the forest. The terrifying sight. "I saw it," Reynolds continued, his eyes unfocused. "Something moving in the trees, shadows, but they weren't shadows. They were something else. They shifted, almost like they were alive, twisting around the trunks." He paused, his breath hitching as the memory overwhelmed him. "I was running, I know that much, but I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. And when I did, there was this thing. It was tall, too tall to be human, but it had the shape of a man, and it was watching me. Its eyes. His voice trailed off again, and he stared down at his hands, trembling. The others exchanged uneasy glances. "What do you think it was?" Peter asked, his voice barely a whisper. Reynolds didn't answer right away. He was lost in thought, his mind haunted by the vision of the figure in the woods, the eyes that seemed to burn into his very soul. "I don't know what it was," he finally muttered. "But whatever it wasn't human, and it was waiting for us." The rising fear. The night grew darker, and the tavern grew quieter as the group continued to discuss their experiences. No one could shake the growing feeling that Black Hollow had somehow changed. The forest had always been mysterious, but now it was something more. It was as if it had become alive, an entity of sorts, with a mind of its own. The whispers that some had heard were just the beginning. The forest was drawing them in, luring them with its dark promises, and now none of them felt safe. The feeling of being watched began to intensify. Some claimed they could feel eyes on them when they walked near the woods. Others spoke of hearing voices in the wind, faint and distant, but growing clearer over time. It was as though the forest was calling out to them, beckoning them into its depths. But no one knew what would happen if they answered the call. "I heard something," Tim confessed, his voice shaking. "Last night I was walking past the edge of the woods, and I heard someone call my name. It sounded like my mother, but she's been dead for years." Peter swallowed hard, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. "That's not the, worst of it," he whispered. "I heard it too, but it was different. It was like something was trying to imitate her voice. It sounded wrong, off, like it was mocking me." The strain of the unknown. As the conversation wore on, it became clear that the town was unraveling. The fear had spread like wildfire, infecting everyone in Ravenswood. There was no logical explanation for what was happening. People were hearing things that didn't make sense, seeing things that couldn't possibly be real. It was as though the forest had taken on a life of its own, and no one was safe. Sheriff Reynolds, though still silent, could feel the weight of their fear. He wasn't the only one who had experienced something strange. The others had seen it too. The forest had marked them, and now it was reaching out to take hold of everyone in Ravenswood. The whispers were just the beginning. Soon they would be too deep to escape. No one in Ravenswood spoke of Black Hollow the same way anymore. It was no longer just a place to avoid. It had become an entity, a malevolent force, and every whisper that echoed from the forest was another reminder of the terror it held. Town left in fear. The days after Sheriff Reynolds' harrowing escape from Black Hollow were filled with a sense of paralysis. Ravenswood, once a close-knit community, now felt fractured, each person retreating into their own private terror. People stayed in their homes more than ever, eyes nervously glancing toward the edge of the woods as if expecting something or someone to emerge from the shadows. Though Reynolds had returned, the town was never the same. The trauma from that fateful night was etched deep in his mind, and his eyes, once full of the unyielding confidence that had come with years of service, were now vacant, haunted. It was clear that the man who had entered Black Hollow was not the same one who had stumbled back to Ravenswood. He was a shadow of the man he once was. The whispers that had begun in the forest spread to every corner of the town. Some claimed to hear footsteps outside their windows at night. Others spoke of eerie, unnatural sounds coming from the woods, the sound of something dragging through the underbrush, soft, slow, deliberate. But nobody dared investigate. Black Hollow had become a forbidden place, a dark abyss into which no one was willing to venture again. It was during one of the quietest nights that something truly unsettling happened. Sheriff Reynolds' return to Black Hollow. Sheriff Reynolds had refused to speak about what had happened in the forest. But after a week of sleepless nights and relentless visions, he could no longer escape the memories. One stormy evening, with the wind howling through the trees, he went to the edge of Black Hollow once again. His hands were shaking as he stood there looking into the abyss. He had to know. He had to confront whatever was lurking within the woods. With every step into the forest, the air grew heavier, the shadows deeper. His mind, already frayed by the horror he had witnessed, began to unravel further as he moved into the heart of Black Hollow. There was something drawing him back, something that had burrowed into his soul and refused to let go. But as he walked, he felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. It wasn't the feeling of a predator stalking its prey. It was different, more insidious. It was as if the forest itself knew him, as if it were aware of his every move. The trees whispered, the wind whispered, and Reynolds' heart began to pound in his chest. Then, deep in the heart of Black Hollow, he saw it again. The figure. The same tall, thin, shadowy form that had watched him the night of the search. Only this time it wasn't just watching. It was moving toward him. Its limbs stretched unnaturally long, bending in ways that defied human movement. And those eyes, they were the same eyes, burning with an otherworldly, malevolent hunger. The encounter. Reynolds froze. His body screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to obey. The figure was close now, too close. He could hear its breath, a low, guttural sound that vibrated through the air like a growl. "You shouldn't have come back." The voice was not a voice at all, but a series of whispers that slid into his mind, as though they were part of him. He tried to move, tried to raise his gun, but his hands were numb, paralyzed with fear. His breathing came in ragged gasps as he fought to remain conscious. He could feel the presence growing stronger, its dark energy pressing in on him, suffocating him. "Leave now," it whispered again. But this time it wasn't a warning. It was a command. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the trees. Reynolds stood alone in the clearing, his heart pounding in his chest. The silence returned, but it was deafening. He was no longer sure what was real, what he had just seen. Was it his mind breaking down, or had the forest truly come alive? The survivor's account. The next morning, Sheriff Reynolds was found on the edge of the forest, disoriented, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide with terror. He had walked out of Black Hollow, but the forest had clearly left its mark. He didn't speak for hours, his mind still trapped in the depths of the darkness he had encountered. Finally, when he could speak, his words were broken, fragmented. It's not just the trees," he muttered. "It's alive. It's a force, an entity, and it's calling us." The townsfolk listened in stunned silence as he recounted what had happened. describing the figure with long limbs, the oppressive feeling of being watched, the whispers in his mind. But as he spoke, something shifted. It wasn't just the story that scared them. It was the conviction in Reynolds's voice. He believed it, and deep down, they knew he wasn't lying. "I barely made it out," Reynolds said, his voice cracking. "I don't know how, but it wasn't just the forest that's dangerous, it's what's in it. Whatever it is, it's hungry, and it won't stop until it has us all." The townspeople began to murmur. Fear and disbelief were replaced with something far darker: acceptance. They could no longer deny what had been happening in Black Hollow for years. The disappearances, the whispers, the strange occurrences, everything now fit together like pieces of a horrifying puzzle, and the truth was more terrifying than they could have ever imagined. A descent into madness, as Reynolds's recounting continued. It became clear that Black Hollow wasn't just a forest. It was a living, breathing entity. It had always been there, watching, waiting, drawing people in with its malevolent presence. But now, the forest had begun to take something much worse: their sanity. Sheriff Reynolds's descent into madness was swift. His sleep became fitful, his behavior erratic. He spoke of visions, shadows in the corner of his eye, voices in the wind, the forest calling him back. Those who saw him growing more and more disheveled began to avoid him. He wasn't just afraid of Black Hollow anymore. He was terrified of himself, of the whispers that had invaded his mind and the unshakable feeling that the forest had claimed him as its own. One evening, Reynolds disappeared. No one knew where he went. There were no signs of struggle, no traces left behind. The town searched the forest again, but as they ventured deeper, they heard nothing. Only the whispers, faint and distant, calling them toward the dark heart of Black Hollow. Sheriff Reynolds, it seemed, had become part of the forest. His fate was now one of many, lost to the hunger that lay within the trees. A town on the brink. In the wake of Reynolds' disappearance, Ravenswood was left in a state of paralyzed terror. The townsfolk had once laughed off the whispers and rumors of Black Hollow, but now the truth was undeniable. The forest was alive, and it was taking them one by one. No one spoke openly about venturing into the woods anymore, yet the whispers still carried on the wind, and sometimes, in the dead of night, they could hear footsteps at the edge of the trees. It was as if Black Hollow was waiting for the next soul to answer its call. A whisper from the past. The disappearance of Sheriff Reynolds, coupled with the growing sense of dread surrounding Black Hollow, left Ravenswood on the edge of collapse. The townsfolk could no longer deny that something far darker than natural forces lurked in the depths of the forest. The whispered rumors, the eerie tales passed down through generations, began to take on a more terrifying weight. But the fear wasn't just rooted in what had happened. It was rooted in what might still come. More and more people began to stay inside their homes, shutting their windows and doors, barricading themselves from the unknown. Yet no matter how tightly they tried to close themselves off from the forest, it still reached out. Its whispers still slipped under the cracks of their doors. Its shadows still loomed at the edges of their windows. As days passed, a new tension filled the air in Ravenswood. Some began to speak of an old legend, one that had been buried in the history of the town. It was a story no one wanted to believe, a tale so dark that it had been forgotten, or perhaps intentionally erased. But now the memory of it surfaced once more, and as it did, it painted a picture of a ritual, a terrible act performed long ago that might be the key to understanding Black Hollow's malevolent power. The Old Journal. Maggie, a local historian and an unlikely voice of reason in Ravenswood, had always been a collector of the town's secrets. The old library in the center of town was filled with dusty volumes of forgotten lore, some of which hadn't seen the light of day in decades. But after the disappearances began, and Sheriff Reynolds' unsettling disappearance added to the growing list of the lost, Maggie turned to one book in particular, an ancient journal. The journal had once belonged to a long-dead historian named Isaac Graves, a man who had documented the founding of Ravenswood. His journal was filled with eerie accounts of strange occurrences around Black Hollow, but one entry in particular stood out. Isaac had written of a series of rituals, dark ceremonies that had taken place within the forest long before the town was founded. These rituals were said to be sacrifices, offerings to a power that resided deep within the woods. The power that Isaac described was not just the typical folklore of spirits and demons, but something far older, something that seemed to breathe through the very trees themselves. They called it the Hollow's Heart. Maggie read aloud to the others in the tavern, her voice trembling slightly. A force bound to the land, a creature born of darkness that could never die. They worshipped it, and in return, it gave them power. But the price for that power was high. It demanded blood. It demanded souls. The room fell silent as Maggie finished reading. The words seemed to hang in the air, thick with dread. The townsfolk exchanged uneasy glances, as if trying to understand how they had been living so close to something so ancient, so dangerous. A Lost History. Isaac Graves had written that the rituals were not merely symbolic, they were real, performed by the earliest settlers of Ravenswood, who believed the land was cursed. They believed that, in order to survive, they had to appease the darkness that thrived within the woods. The Hollow's Heart demanded its tribute, a life, a soul to feed its endless hunger. Over time, the rituals became more sporadic, fading into the town's folklore. The settlers' descendants, as the town grew, forgot the old ways, or chose to bury them in order to live normal lives. But Isaac's journal was clear. The price had never been paid in full. And the Hollow's Heart, the dark force at the center of Black Hollow, had not forgotten. Maggie turned the page, her finger tracing the next part of the journal. It says here, "The last ritual was performed at the dawn of Ravenswood's founding, but the forest's hunger did not cease. It waits. It waits for the moment when the balance is broken, when the souls are owed once more." Her voice faltered as she read the chilling words. The balance is broken. We're paying the price now. The aftermath of the ritual, the morning. After Maggie and the others ventured into Black Hollow, Ravenswood was a town divided between disbelief and a deep, growing terror. It was nearly impossible for anyone to ignore the strange, unnatural events that had unfolded in the forest. Despite the absence of the group, something was different. The air felt thicker, as if the very earth itself was holding its breath. The wind whispered even more urgently, tugging at the edges of the town, pulling at the people who had once been content to live in ignorance. The town's residents gathered in hushed groups, talking in fearful tones about the disappearance of Maggie and her team. A few claimed to have seen eerie lights flickering at the edges of the forest the night before, like fires being kindled, while others swore they'd heard unearthly sounds carried on the wind, low, mournful wails, the kind of sound you would expect from something not entirely human. The whispers in the trees had become louder. But it wasn't just the trees that had changed. Ravenswood itself seemed to have become a shadow of its former self, as if the town had been drained of its life force. The streets, once full of the hum of daily activity, had fallen eerily quiet. People moved about in a daze, as if they were trying to outrun something they didn't fully understand. But the truth was that they couldn't outrun the forest. It had been watching them for generations, and now it was coming for them. The return of the heart. It wasn't long before the first signs of the Hollow's wrath began to show themselves. Animals were found dead in strange ways, mutilated, their bodies twisted in unnatural positions, their eyes wide open in terror. The trees surrounding the forest seemed to grow darker, their trunks slick with a dark, sap-like substance that had a strange, metallic sheen. And worst of all, the sky began to darken, the clouds hanging thick and heavy, as if the forest itself were pulling the light from the world. The people of Ravenswood began to notice that, while the forest seemed to be expanding, it was also drawing closer. It was as though the boundary between Black Hollow and the town had blurred. Trees that had once been miles away seemed to be encroaching on the town's outskirts, their dark branches reaching toward the homes, as though they were trying to pull the very houses into the heart of the forest. The end of Ravenswood. When the light faded and the forest went silent, only a few remained. The survivors, those who had managed to escape the forest's grasp, stood on the edge of Black Hollow, staring at the now quiet woods. The heart was gone. But so was Ravenswood. The forest, though no longer the twisted, malevolent force it had once been, had claimed its final victory. The town was no more. Black Hollow had consumed it entirely. And as the survivors left, they knew one thing for certain. The Hollow's hunger was never truly satisfied. It had only been postponed. Thanks for watching. Subscribe our channel Storycraft for more interesting videos.